The day had begun like any other for Linda Carter. The sun had risen lazily over Los Angeles, spilling a golden warmth across the quiet suburban street where she had lived for nearly 40 years. Her little white house with its ivy-covered porch stood as a gentle reminder of a life built on perseverance, love, and quiet dignity. At 73, Linda had no illusions about her age or her circumstances. Her husband had passed away years ago, her children had families of their own, and most of her days were spent tending to her garden, volunteering at the library, or visiting her local church. She was not rich, but she was proud of having lived a life guided by honesty, kindness, and hard work. That afternoon, however, Linda felt a nervous flutter in her stomach as she gathered her things from the kitchen table. A neat envelope lay there, containing the bank statements that had been bothering her for weeks. Tiny, almost unnoticeable deductions had started appearing in her account, $5 here, $12 there. At first, she had dismissed them as simple clerical errors, but when the total began to add up, eating into her modest monthly pension, she knew something wasn't right. She checked her reflection in the hallway mirror before leaving. Her gray hair was neatly pinned up, her floral blouse freshly ironed, and the pearl earrings her late husband had given her still gleamed faintly against her wrinkled skin. She looked like what she had always been, a woman of quiet grace. She slipped on her shoes, grabbed her handbag, and took a deep breath before stepping out into the sunlight. The First Pacific Bank on Wilshire Boulevard was a place she had trusted for decades. She had opened her first account there as a young teacher, fresh out of college, full of hope and determination. The tellers had known her by name then, smiling warmly each time she walked in. But time changed everything. The faces were no longer familiar, the greetings no longer personal. Now the building stood tall and impersonal, a sleek glass box reflecting the restless city around it. By the time Linda arrived, the parking lot was nearly full. It was a Friday afternoon, the kind of day when people hurried to finish errands before the weekend. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of impatience, lines stretching from the counters to the glass doors, the soft whir of counting machines, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, and the muffled sighs of customers checking their watches. Linda joined the line quietly, holding her envelope close to her chest. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from nerves. She had never liked confrontation. Even as a teacher, she had always believed in kindness over authority, reason over force. Yet today she needed answers. Ahead of her, a young man argued loudly with a teller about a declined transaction, while a mother tried to calm her crying toddler. The security guard by the door looked bored, scrolling through his phone, his expression indifferent. Everyone seemed caught up in their own frustrations, too busy to notice the elderly woman standing patiently among them. When Linda finally reached the counter, she was greeted by a young teller named Brittany Wallace. Brittany was in her mid-20s with a polished look, perfect eyeliner, manicured nails, and the kind of practiced smile that never reached her eyes. She had already been through a long day. The exhaustion showed in her tone and posture. "Next," Brittany called without looking up. Linda stepped forward, placing her envelope on the counter. "Good afternoon, dear," she said politely, her voice soft but clear. "I believe there's been a mistake with my account. There are some fees I wasn't informed about." Brittany didn't respond right away. Her fingers kept flying across the keyboard, her eyes fixed on the screen. "What kind of fees?" she asked flatly. "Maintenance fees, I think," Linda said, opening the envelope and carefully pulling out the receipts and statements she had printed. "They just appeared recently. I've had this account for years and I've never been charged like this before." Brittany finally looked up, her expression betraying a mix of impatience and disinterest. "Those are standard account maintenance fees, ma'am," she said, her voice carrying the faint edge of someone repeating a line for the 100th time that day. Linda frowned slightly, still polite but confused. "Oh, I see. But these fees, they weren't here before. Has something changed?" Brittany sighed, tapping her nails on the counter before grabbing the papers from Linda's hand. She glanced through them quickly, then pushed them back. "It's in the fine print of your agreement," she said. "If you didn't read it, that's not our fault." The words struck harder than Linda expected. There was no kindness in them, no attempt to help or explain, just dismissal. She blinked, taken aback, her voice trembling slightly. I thought I understood my account. I've never, Brittany rolled her eyes, cutting her off. Look, ma'am, she said loudly enough that a few people in line glanced over. If you want to avoid the fees, you just need to keep more money in your account. That's how banks work. A quiet chuckle rippled through the line behind Linda. She felt her cheeks grow warm. The humiliation was subtle but sharp, an invisible sting that sank deep. She wasn't trying to argue. She simply wanted clarity. I've been a customer here for over 30 years, Linda said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I've always kept my balance steady. I just wanted to understand. Brittany gave a small, exasperated laugh, shaking her head. Ma'am, policies change. You'll have to adapt. At that moment, Linda realized that kindness had become a rarity in places like this. She looked around, hoping for a sympathetic face, but the other customers avoided her eyes. The security guard still scrolled on his phone. The people in line shifted impatiently, and the only sound was the steady click of keyboards. I just want someone to explain why this is happening, she said quietly. But Brittany had already turned her attention to the computer again. That was when Carl Jensen, the branch manager, appeared from his glass office. Tall, well-dressed, and sharp-featured, Carl carried himself with the kind of authority that demanded attention. He had noticed the exchange from a distance and decided it was time to intervene, not to help, but to control. Is there a problem here? He asked, his tone clipped and professional. Brittany straightened immediately. No problem, sir, she said quickly. Just a customer who doesn't understand our policies. Carl's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. He turned to Linda, looking her up and down with the detached politeness of someone already calculating how much of his time she was worth. Ma'am, we have standard fees in place, he said. If you can't maintain the minimum balance, there's nothing we can do. Linda's lips pressed together. But I've never had this issue before. These charges just appeared recently. I only want someone to review them. Carl chuckled quietly as if humoring her. What's in the system is in the system, he said. We don't review automated charges. Linda's eyes widened slightly. You mean there's no way to check if they're correct? Carl leaned forward, lowering his voice, though not low enough to keep others from hearing. If you can't afford the fees, he said with a condescending smirk, maybe this bank isn't the right place for you. The words hung in the air like a slap. A sharp silence followed. The sound of keyboards stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence, and every eye in the lobby turned toward the small, trembling woman at the counter. Linda's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. The humiliation was total. She had never been treated like this, not as a teacher, not as a customer, not as a human being. Her fingers tightened around the envelope, and for a moment she thought about walking out, just leaving quietly and never coming back. But something inside her refused to move, something that whispered that walking away would make it worse. The silence stretched. Carl straightened his tie, satisfied with himself, and Brittany smirked faintly, thinking the situation was over. But then, a voice cut through the stillness, deep, steady, and unmistakably firm. Why are you talking to her like that? Every head in the bank turned. At the entrance stood a man in jeans, a black t-shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His stance was casual but powerful, his tone calm yet commanding. There was something about the way he stood, an effortless confidence that made people instinctively pay attention. Carl frowned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. And who are you, he snapped, to question how we handle our customers? The man stepped forward, removing his cap. Gasps rippled through the room. Vin Diesel. Yes, that Vin Diesel. The bank fell silent. And in that silence, everything was about to change. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if the air itself had frozen the moment the man spoke. His deep voice had cut through the crowded bank like a blade through still water, and now all eyes were fixed on him. The whispers started immediately, low and disbelieving as recognition spread through the crowd. It wasn't just anyone. It was Vin Diesel, the action star, the man who'd spent decades on screen standing up for justice, family, and loyalty. And now, there he was, standing in a real-life confrontation that felt more cinematic than anything Hollywood could have scripted. Carl Jensen blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. For a moment, he looked caught between disbelief and annoyance. He straightened his jacket, forcing a tight smile that didn't match the irritation flickering behind his eyes. Mr. Diesel, he began awkwardly, his tone a mix of forced politeness and discomfort. I think you might be misunderstanding the situation. Vin's expression didn't change. His calm, level gaze stayed fixed on Carl, and somehow that quiet stare said more than any threat could. No, he said simply, his voice steady, each word deliberate. I think I understand perfectly. I saw the way you spoke to her. Carl's lips parted slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of a full room of customers. Sir, this is a private matter between the bank and a customer. You have no right to. Vin took a step forward, just one, but it was enough to make the space feel smaller. When you humiliate someone in public, he said, his tone low but cutting, it's not private anymore. The crowd murmured in agreement. Brittany, the teller, glanced nervously between her manager and the Hollywood actor, her earlier arrogance draining away fast. The other customers, and the ones who had stayed quiet during Linda's humiliation, now stood straighter, alert, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Linda herself could hardly believe what was happening. She clutched her envelope to her chest, her heart pounding. It felt surreal. This man, this celebrity standing up for her, a retired schoolteacher who had never expected anyone to notice her at all. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him it was all right, but the words wouldn't come. Carl, trying to regain control, forced a dismissive laugh. Mr. Diesel, with all due respect, you don't understand how banking works. We have policies and regulations. Vin cut him off with a raised hand, his gaze unwavering. What I understand, he said quietly, is respect, and I didn't see any. The silence that followed was heavy. Even the sound of the air conditioner seemed to fade. Carl shifted uncomfortably, his hand twitching against the counter as if searching for something to hold on to. Vin turned slightly toward Linda, his tone softening. Ma'am, he said gently, what exactly happened here? Linda hesitated. I just wanted to know why there were new fees on my account, she said softly, her voice trembling. I've had this account for years. The charges just appeared, and I thought there was a mistake. Vin nodded slowly, then looked back at Carl. Seems simple enough to me. So why make it complicated? Carl cleared his throat. It's policy, he repeated, the same excuse he'd used 1,000 times before. We have maintenance fees based on account types. If she can't maintain a minimum balance, then what? Vin asked, his voice still calm but colder now. You embarrass her in front of everyone? Carl's face darkened. Sir, this is not your concern. Vin tilted his head, studying him for a moment, then smiled faintly. Not the friendly kind of smile, but the one that comes right before a storm. You know what's funny? He said, his tone almost conversational. That's what bullies always say right before someone calls them out. The crowd reacted audibly this time. A few gasps, a couple have murmured, that's right, from the back. Brittany bit her lip, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. Vin took another step closer, the distance between him and Carl shrinking until the tension was thick enough to taste. Here's what I see, he said, gesturing toward Linda. A woman who spent her life teaching, probably helped hundreds of kids learn to read, learn to think, and now she's standing here being treated like she's nothing. Over what, a few dollars in fees? Carl opened his mouth, but Vin kept going, his voice growing firmer. You've got a lobby full of customers watching how you treat people. You represent this bank, right? You're supposed to serve them, not shame them. Carl's jaw clenched. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, his composure cracking for the first time. You're an actor. You don't understand real business. Vin smiled slightly, his eyes narrowing. You're right, he said. I don't play games with people's lives for profit. I just understand human decency. Maybe that's the business you're not in. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Brittany looked down, ashamed. A young man near the back of the line discreetly lifted his phone, recording the scene. Others did the same, sensing they were witnessing something far bigger than a simple argument. Vin finally broke the silence. You said it's all in the system, he said, gesturing toward the computer. Let's see it. Pull up her account, Carl blinked. Excuse me? You heard me, Vin said calmly. If you're so sure those fees are valid, show us. Carl hesitated. His eyes darted to Brittany. Mr. Diesel, that's confidential information. Vin's expression didn't change. She's standing right here, he said. She's giving you permission, right, ma'am? Linda nodded immediately, her small voice steadying for the first time. Yes, you can show him. Carl swallowed hard. He could feel the walls closing in. The customers were watching. The phones were recording. There was no easy way out. With visible reluctance, he turned to Brittany. "Pull it up," he muttered. Brittany hesitated. "Sir, maybe we should—" "Now," Carl barked. She flinched and began typing. The rhythmic clatter of keys echoed in the tense air as she navigated the system. The screen flickered, then filled with numbers, dates, and transaction records. Vin leaned in slightly, studying it with quiet focus. The silence stretched again, everyone waiting for him to speak. Finally, he tapped the monitor lightly. "There," he said. "The fees started 2 months ago." He glanced back at Carl. "That's right after a policy change, isn't it?" Carl's throat tightened. "Possibly," he muttered. Vin's tone was still even, but now it carried weight, the kind of weight that made excuses crumble. "And did you personally review these changes before applying them to long-term customers?" Carl hesitated. "The system handles those automatically," he said. "So you didn't check," Vin said. Carl's silence said everything. Vin looked around the room, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "How many of you have had new fees show up recently?" A pause. Then a few hands went up. A middle-aged man in work clothes, an elderly couple, a young woman holding her baby. One by one, more hands followed. Vin nodded slowly. So it's not just her. The realization rippled through the room. People began murmuring, comparing notes, showing each other their receipts. The atmosphere shifted from quiet frustration to collective outrage. Carl looked pale now. "Mr. Diesel," he said quickly, "you're creating a disturbance." "No," Vin interrupted softly. "I'm revealing one." He turned back to Linda. "You've been a customer here for decades, right?" "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Since the 70s, Vin nodded. "And no one bothered to explain these new fees to you?" "No one," she said. "I only found out when my balance started dropping." Vin turned to Carl again. "So your system automatically triples the fees for loyal elderly customers without warning, and you call that policy?" Carl's lips trembled. "That's how the bank operates." Vin took a deep breath and shook his head. "No, that's how greed operates." The crowd reacted with a murmur of approval. Someone clapped quietly. Carl's composure was gone. His face was red, his eyes darting from Vin to the growing number of recording phones. He could feel his career unraveling with every passing second. Vin's tone softened again, but it was still firm. "You know what I've learned in my life?" he said, looking at the crowd. "Systems make mistakes. People make choices. And what you did here, humiliating this woman, that wasn't a system error. That was a choice." He turned to Brittany, whose hands were still frozen above the keyboard. "You knew this wasn't right, didn't you?" Brittany swallowed hard. I just follow instructions," she whispered. Vin nodded slightly, understanding but not excusing. Sometimes doing the right thing means not following bad ones. Carl opened his mouth to speak, but the sound that came out was barely more than a stammer. The control he'd once commanded was gone. The authority that had silenced countless customers before had vanished under the weight of truth. Vin stood tall, his voice steady. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to reverse these charges, not just for her, but for everyone affected. And then you're going to apologize." Carl's eyes widened. "You can't just—" "I can," Vin said quietly. "And you will. Because the people deserve to be treated with respect." The crowd erupted in quiet applause. Brittany's eyes filled with tears. Linda stood there speechless, watching the scene unfold like something out of a dream. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel small. She felt seen. For a long moment after Vin Diesel's final words, the bank remained in stunned silence. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavier than noise, filled with the weight of realization. Carl Jensen stood frozen behind the counter, the color drained from his face. His mind, usually sharp and quick with excuses, was blank. Around him, the customers began murmuring. Voices low but united, carrying a current of awakening through the air. Linda Carter still stood near the counter, her fingers loosely clutching the envelope she had brought with such trembling hands. Only now, those same hands didn't shake. Something inside her had shifted. Something deep, long buried, a quiet strength that had lain dormant for years. She turned slightly to glance at Vin, who met her gaze with a small, reassuring nod. It wasn't a smile of victory, but of quiet solidarity, the kind shared between two people who understood what it meant to stand up against injustice, no matter how small. Carl exhaled sharply and turned toward Brittany, his voice brittle but low enough to mask his fear. "Fix it," he muttered, his tone trembling with restrained fury. "Reverse the charges. Do it now." Brittany didn't argue. Her fingers flew. Across the keyboard, her earlier confidence now replaced by an almost frantic obedience. Each click of the keys felt like a nail in Carl's coffin, each confirmation sound from the computer a quiet testament that his authority was unraveling. The crowd watched as lines of text appeared on the glowing screen. Balances adjusted, fees disappeared, and error messages cleared. For the customers, many of whom had quietly endured similar charges, it was the first visible sign of fairness they'd seen in years. Vin leaned slightly over the counter, his eyes scanning the numbers. When the last reversal was entered, he nodded once. "That's more like it." Carl swallowed hard. "There, it's done," he said, trying to keep his voice even. Vin looked at him. "Not quite," he said calmly. "You forgot something." Carl blinked. "What?" "The apology," Vin said. His tone wasn't sharp or mocking. It was simple, direct, and heavy with expectation. Carl's jaw tightened. He stopped himself, feeling the eyes of everyone in the bank pressing on him like a physical force. He was used to being the one in control, the one commanding the room. But now every face around him waited for him to do something he had never done before. Admit he was wrong. He cleared his throat, forcing the words out. "Mrs. Carter," he began stiffly. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Vin's eyebrow lifted slightly and Carl winced, realizing how hollow that sounded. He tried again, this time softer. "I'm sorry for the way you were treated," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "It was unacceptable." Linda studied him for a moment, the years of teaching and quiet wisdom in her gaze. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Thank you," she said. And in that small, gentle reply, there was more grace than Carl could muster in a lifetime. Vin nodded once, satisfied. Then he turned to the customers, his deep voice filling the room. "You saw what happened here today," he said. "Let it remind you, never let anyone make you feel small for asking for fairness. You have a voice. Use it." The crowd erupted in quiet applause, the sound more powerful for its restraint. For a moment, the sterile corporate bank felt alive again, filled not with tension but with something human. Vin gave Linda one last nod before slipping his cap back on. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the doors. The light from outside caught him as he stepped through, and for a brief instant, it was as if a scene from a film had been written into reality. The hero walking away not for glory but because the job was done. But the story wasn't over. Inside, Carl stood motionless, his mind spinning. His authority had crumbled in front of 100 witnesses, and worse, several of them were still holding up their phones, recording. The young man near the front, a college student in a hoodie, grinned as he tapped his screen. "Already uploaded, buddy," he said with a smirk. "You can't erase this." Carl's heart dropped. For the first time in years, he felt fear. Not the mild anxiety of deadlines or quotas, but the deep, sinking kind that comes from realizing your entire career might be collapsing in real time. "Turn those off," he barked, his voice cracking. But no one listened. The power he once commanded was gone. Customers who had avoided eye contact with him moments ago now met his gaze with boldness, even disdain. Linda stepped back from the counter, her expression calm. She didn't gloat. That wasn't in her nature. But as she turned toward the door, she felt lighter than she had in years. For decades, she had taught her students about standing up for what was right, about courage, empathy, and respect. She never thought she'd need to relearn those lessons at 73. Brittany watched her go, guilt clawing at her chest. She had spent years working in customer service, convincing herself that the small cruelties, the impatience, the dismissive tones, were just part of the job. But now, after watching that woman walk out with her dignity restored, Brittany felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Shame. She turned toward Carl, whose face was now pale and drawn. "Sir," she said quietly, "maybe we should report this to corporate." "If they see the video first," Carl spun around, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you really think corporate is going to believe some old woman over me?" He snapped. "I've been running this branch for 8 years. They'll back me." He tried to sound confident, but even he could hear the cracks forming in his own words. Before he could say more, a chime rang out, then another and another. Notifications. The sound came from phones all over the bank, a ripple of digital noise that made everyone look down at their screens. The young man in the hoodie looked up, grinning wider. "Told you," he said. "It's blowing up already." Carl's stomach twisted as he fumbled for his own phone. His screen lit up with a flood of alerts, tags, mentions, shares. The video was everywhere. His face, his name, his words, all caught in perfect clarity. "Oh no," he whispered. Within minutes, the video was being watched by thousands. The title burned across screens like a headline. "Elderly woman humiliated at bank. Vin Diesel steps in." In the footage, everything was there. His sneer, his dismissive tone, his cruel remark about Linda not belonging. The internet didn't need context. It had judgment, and it was swift. A woman near the counter whispered, "That's him. That's our manager." Others nodded, muttering, shaking their heads. The power dynamic that had once tilted so heavily in Carl's favor had flipped entirely. He was no longer the authority. He was the cautionary tale. The phone on Brittany's desk began to ring. She looked at the caller ID and froze. "It's corporate," she whispered. Carl hesitated only a second before snatching up the receiver. "This is Carl Jensen," he said quickly, his voice hoarse but trying to sound professional. The voice on the other end was sharp, cold, and businesslike. "Mr. Jensen," it said, "we need to talk. Now." Carl's breath hitched. He turned toward the office, muttering something about privacy before slamming the door behind him. Outside, the mood in the bank was surreal. The tension had broken, replaced by an odd mix of disbelief and quiet triumph. Customers exchanged glances, some even smiling. Brittany leaned against her counter, exhaling deeply. She glanced at Linda, who was gathering her things slowly near the door, as if she couldn't quite believe the day was real. "Mrs. Carter," Brittany called softly. Linda turned, her expression gentle but tired. Brittany's voice faltered. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you. You didn't deserve that." Linda studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you, dear," she said softly. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Brittany swallowed hard. "I really am sorry," she said again. "You shouldn't have had to fight for what should have been fair from the start." Linda smiled faintly. "That's the real apology," she said. Then she turned and pushed open the heavy glass doors. The sunlight poured in, wrapping her in warmth as she stepped outside. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. Meanwhile, inside his office, Carl sat hunched over his desk. The phone pressed against his ear as the voice from corporate cut through him like a knife. Words like investigation, policy violations, and public relations crisis hit him one after another. He tried to defend himself, to claim misunderstanding, but it was no use. The video had done more damage in 30 minutes than any report or complaint ever could. By the time the call ended, his hands were shaking. He sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. For years, he had believed he was untouchable, a man too valuable to be questioned. But now, his title, his reputation, his confidence, all of it was slipping away. Outside, the bank continued as if waking from a long sleep. People returned to their business, but their conversations were different now. There was a spark of unity, of quiet courage in the air, and Linda, walking down the sidewalk toward the bus stop, felt something inside her heart she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The world could still be cruel, yes, but sometimes the right person showed up at the right moment to remind it of its humanity. And when they did, Even the smallest act of dignity could ripple across the world. By evening, the story had already escaped the four glass walls of the First Pacific Bank. It traveled through whispers, through text messages, and then, faster than any of them could comprehend, through screens. Within hours, the clip that began with a simple confrontation had become the most shared video on every social media platform. The title was simple, almost poetic in its honesty. Elderly woman humiliated at bank until Vin Diesel spoke up. At first, the video played quietly across timelines, watched by a few hundred people, then a few thousand. But something about it, the rawness, the humanity, the sharp contrast between cruelty and compassion, struck a chord. People didn't just watch, they felt. The comments flooded in faster than the servers could process them. This made me cry. More people need to be like him. She's the kind of woman who reminds you of your grandmother, and he's the kind of man who reminds you what decency looks like. Within hours, the clip had millions of views. News outlets picked it up. Hashtags trended. Memes appeared, some funny, some heartfelt. A small act of courage had become a global moment of reflection, a rare spark of goodness in an online world so often filled with anger and noise. Meanwhile, at the center of the storm, Carl Jensen sat in his office long after closing time. The blinds were drawn, but even they couldn't block out the glow of his phone screen as notification after notification kept appearing. His name was everywhere. His face, captured mid-smirk as he leaned over the counter to insult Linda Carter, had become the image of arrogance across the internet. He had stopped counting after the first 1,000 mentions. The emails from corporate had turned from urgent to critical. The last one didn't even address him by title anymore. It simply read, "Effective immediately. Your access to company systems has been suspended pending investigation. Do not return to the branch until further notice." The words felt unreal. He stared at them for a long time, as if sheer disbelief could make them disappear. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the cup of coffee that had long gone cold. In all his years of working for the bank, he had built his reputation on efficiency, control, power. And now it was gone, undone by a few cruel sentences and one man's decision to speak up. Carl buried his face in his hands. The silence of his office pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. Across town, in a small one-bedroom apartment lit softly by a single lamp, Brittany Wallace sat on her couch staring at the same video. She had watched it more times than she could count, her eyes always lingering on the moment when she had looked down at her computer, while Linda Carter pleaded quietly for fairness. Each replay hurt a little more. It wasn't just guilt. It was recognition. She saw herself in every impatient sigh, every dismissive glance she'd given to people who came to her counter just needing a little patience. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing faces and started seeing transactions. That realization broke her heart. She closed her laptop and buried her face in her hands. The tears came quietly at first, then harder. She thought of her own grandmother, a woman who had raised her, who used to wait patiently in long lines just to pay bills in person because she didn't trust machines. If someone had spoken to her the way Brittany had spoken to Linda that day, she would have been crushed. Brittany knew what she had to do. The next morning, she arrived at the bank before anyone else. The lobby was eerily quiet. Reporters had started hovering outside, waiting for someone to comment. She ignored them and went straight to her desk, where Linda's now empty envelope still sat, a forgotten artifact of the moment that had changed everything. She picked it up gently, running her thumb over the worn paper, then placed it in her bag. "I owe her this," she whispered to herself. By noon, the official statement from the bank was released. It spread almost as fast as the video itself. First Pacific Bank condemns the behavior witnessed at our Wilshire Boulevard branch. We have initiated an internal investigation, suspended involved management, and are reviewing all recent account fees. We apologize to our customers and are committed to restoring trust. It was the kind of apology written by lawyers, clean and corporate, lacking the sincerity of the moment that had inspired it. But to the public it meant one thing: the bank had been forced to act. Within 48 hours, Carl Jensen was officially removed from his position. Corporate cited violation of company values and failure to ensure ethical customer treatment. The statement didn't name him directly, but everyone knew. His photo had already been circulated enough. For Linda Carter, life moved slower, And yet, somehow, everything around her had sped up. She found out about the video the next morning when her neighbor, a cheerful woman named Gloria, knocked on her door holding a tablet. "Linda, you're on the news," she exclaimed. Linda blinked, her teacup halfway to her lips. "I'm what?" Gloria pushed the tablet into her hands. The headline glowed across the screen, and there she was, standing at the bank counter, small and trembling, with Vin Diesel by her side. "Oh my," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. Her first instinct was embarrassment. The idea of the whole world watching her at such a vulnerable moment made her heart race. But as she scrolled through the comments, she saw something she hadn't expected. Messages of support, gratitude, admiration. Strangers from across the world were thanking her, not just for enduring what she did, but for being brave enough to stand there with quiet dignity instead of anger. "You remind me of my mom. My grandma went through something like this. You didn't yell. You didn't curse. You just asked for fairness. That's strength." Tears filled her eyes as she read them. She had never thought of herself as strong, just ordinary. But maybe, she thought, ordinary people could still make a difference simply by refusing to bow to injustice. For the next few days, her phone didn't stop ringing. Local reporters wanted interviews. Talk shows wanted her story. Churches and community centers invited her to speak about respect and dignity, but Linda declined most of them. She wasn't seeking attention. What happened at the bank wasn't about fame. It was about something far quieter and more sacred: respect. She spent her days the same way she always had, tending to her garden, reading her Bible, calling her grandchildren. But now, when she walked through her neighborhood, people recognized her. Some smiled, others stopped to thank her. The grocery store clerk offered to carry her bags. Even the mailman greeted her with newfound warmth. Still, every night when the world grew quiet again, she thought about that moment, the moment when the voice had cut through the noise. Why are you talking to her like that? She could still hear it, still feel the calm, firm power behind it. Vin Diesel hadn't stayed for thanks or attention. He hadn't posed for cameras or made a speech. He had simply walked out after doing what was right, as if the moment was never about him. And somehow that made it all the more powerful. Across Los Angeles, Vin himself sat quietly in his trailer on a film set, scrolling through the headlines. The video had reached him too, not because he sought it, but because it had found him. His assistant had shown it to him that night, laughing, "Boss, you broke the internet." Vin watched it only once. He didn't need to relive it. He had been there. But seeing how people had reacted, how they had united around kindness, filled him with a quiet sense of pride. He wasn't a man of many words outside the screen. Fame had taught him that the loudest voices weren't always the truest. But this simple act of humanity, reminded him of the values he tried to live by even when no one was watching. He opened his notebook and began to write a few lines. Not a public statement, not for the press. Just a message, a small gesture meant for the woman who had unknowingly reminded him what decency looked like in its purest form. Back at the bank, change was beginning to take root. Corporate investigators arrived within the week. The atmosphere was different now, tense but hopeful. Brittany, now working under temporary supervision, made it her mission to greet every customer with genuine care. She even started a new system, personally reviewing all senior accounts to ensure no one else experienced what Linda had. The customers noticed. The tone of the place changed, and though it would take months to rebuild trust, something real had begun to heal. One afternoon, as Brittany filed the last report of the day, she glanced at the clock and sighed. It had been exhausting and emotionally, mentally, morally. But as she turned off her monitor, she noticed something taped to the side of her desk. A small, handwritten note left by an elderly customer earlier that week. It read, "Thank you for your kindness today. The world needs more of it." She smiled faintly. Maybe she couldn't undo what she'd done, but she could do better moving forward. Miles away in her cozy kitchen, Linda Carter sat by the window, sipping her tea. The morning light streamed in gently, catching the edges of the photo frames lining her table. Pictures of her husband, her students, her family. She felt peace again, but this peace was different. It wasn't the quiet of routine. It was the calm that comes after surviving a storm. She thought about the bank, about Brittany's trembling apology, about Carl's fallen pride, and about the stranger who had walked in like an answer to an unspoken prayer. She smiled softly to herself. Angels don't always have wings, she murmured. Sometimes they wear t-shirts and baseball caps. And as if on cue, a gentle knock echoed at her door. When she opened it, there was no one there, only an envelope resting neatly on her welcome mat. Her name was written across it in smooth, bold handwriting. She picked it up, her heart beginning to race. The return address made her breath catch. Los Angeles, a film studio, and the signature in the corner. Vin Diesel. The world outside Linda Carter's home was still, bathed in the soft golden haze of a Los Angeles morning. A faint breeze rustled the curtains as sunlight streamed through the lace-draped windows, touching the old photographs on her wall. The frozen smiles of loved ones long gone, the classroom portraits of children she had once taught, the wedding picture she still kept on the mantel. Each photo told a chapter of her life, one built on patience, faith, and quiet endurance. But that morning, something new lay on her kitchen table. An envelope, simple and unassuming, yet carrying a weight that made her hands tremble as she reached for it. Her name was written across the front in bold, careful strokes. Mrs. Linda Carter. In the corner, the sender's details were neatly typed, Los Angeles Film Studios, and below it, in smaller script, a single name, Vin Diesel. Her heart thudded softly in her chest. It couldn't be, could it? She sat down slowly, the chair creaking under her as she turned the envelope over in her weathered hands. The paper felt expensive, thick, and smooth beneath her fingertips. There was no mistaking it. Taking a slow breath, she carefully tore open the seal. Inside was a folded letter, handwritten on cream-colored stationery. The ink was dark, precise, and strong, the handwriting of someone who wrote with intention, not haste. She unfolded it and her eyes fell on the first line. Mrs. Carter, you didn't need me to stand up for you that day. She blinked, reading the words again, her breath catching. You already had the strength inside you. All I did was remind you, and maybe remind everyone else watching, that kindness and respect should never go out of style. Her throat tightened. She read on, her fingers trembling as she followed each word with her heart more than her eyes. When I walked into that bank, I didn't plan to get involved. I was just another person waiting in line, watching the world move a little too fast, people forgetting to care. But then I saw how they treated you, the way you stood there, not angry, not loud, just asking for what was fair. And I realized something. You were teaching all of us a lesson without even trying. Linda's eyes blurred with tears. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, reading on. In a world where shouting gets more attention than kindness, your silence spoke louder. You showed grace when others showed arrogance. You reminded me of my own mother. Strong, humble, patient. The kind of woman who raised men like me to believe that doing the right thing isn't a performance. It's a choice. You might not think what you did mattered beyond that moment, but I promise you it did. The world saw it. They saw you. And for a brief moment, millions of people remembered what decency looks like. A single tear slipped down her cheek and landed on the paper. She smiled through it, shaking her head gently as she whispered, "Oh, Vin." The letter continued, steady and sincere. I wanted to thank you, not for what you endured, but for what you reminded me of. People like you, the quiet ones who don't demand attention, who carry themselves with dignity even when the world forgets how to treat them. You're the real heroes. You're the reason people like me try to be better, even when no one's watching. I hope this letter finds you in peace, and I hope you know that because of you, more people will think twice before speaking down to someone they don't understand. Enclosed, you'll find something small, a token of gratitude. It's nothing compared to what you've given the world this week, a reminder that humanity still exists. Linda reached inside the envelope again and found 2 items, a glossy folded invitation and a rolled movie poster tied with a gold ribbon. She unrolled it slowly, her eyes widening. It was a Fast and Furious poster signed in silver marker. To Mrs. Carter, a real-life inspiration. With respect and love. Vin Diesel. The handwriting was unmistakable. Beneath it, his signature gleamed. She held it close to her chest for a long moment, overcome. Then she unfolded the second item, the invitation. It was addressed to her personally, printed in elegant black font. You are invited to the world premiere of Fast X Legacy Guest of Honor. Mrs. Linda Carter Venue, Dolby Theater, Hollywood, Los Angeles. Her breath caught. She almost laughed, a shaky, disbelieving laugh that turned into a teary smile. The thought of herself, a retired schoolteacher from a quiet Los Angeles suburb, walking down the red carpet at a movie premiere, felt like something out of a dream. And yet, she could almost hear his voice as she read the final line of the letter. You taught me that heroes don't just live on screens. Some walk quietly among us, holding envelopes, not knowing the world will soon know their name. Hope this makes you smile. Then for a long while, she didn't move. The sunlight glowed on her hands as she held the letter, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not pride in fame or recognition, but in the life she had lived. In the small, quiet choices that had shaped her into the kind of person worth standing up for. She stood and walked toward the window, the city stretching before her, alive and humming. Somewhere out there, people were still sharing her story. Some were angry, others inspired, but all of them in some small way had been touched by it. She folded the letter gently and placed it in the top drawer of her desk, beside her husband's old watch and the silver locket she had worn on her wedding day. Then she lifted the poster, smiling at the signature that shimmered faintly in the light. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, phone in hand, staring at the invitation once more. The idea of crowds, lights, and cameras made her nervous, but something in her heart whispered that she had to go. Not for attention, not for validation, but for closure. A week later, the red carpet stretched under the bright Hollywood lights, glittering like a river of stars. Reporters called out names, cameras flashed, and fans cheered from behind barriers. Amid the glamour and chaos, a car door opened quietly near the end of the carpet, and Linda Carter stepped out. She wore a soft blue dress that shimmered under the lights and a matching shawl that her daughter had helped her pick. Her hair was neatly styled, her pearl earrings gleaming faintly, the same ones she had worn the day she walked into that bank. The crowd didn't know her name at first, but the moment someone shouted, "That's her! The lady from the video!" a wave of recognition swept through. People began clapping, not out of celebrity worship but respect. Vin Diesel, standing a few feet away giving an interview, turned at the sound. His eyes found her instantly, and a wide, genuine smile spread across his face. Without hesitation, he excused himself and walked toward her. The cameras turned, the flashes ignited. But when he reached her, the noise faded. "Mrs. Carter," he said warmly, offering his hand. "Mr. Diesel," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "You didn't have to do all this," he smiled. "You did more than you realize. You reminded the world what strength looks like." For a moment, they stood there, two souls from different worlds, united by one simple truth. Doing the right thing never goes unnoticed. Inside the theater, as the lights dimmed and the screen came to life, Linda sat quietly among stars and strangers, her heart full. She didn't need fame. She didn't need applause. She had already received something far greater. The knowledge that in one ordinary moment, she had changed the world by refusing to let it change her. When the credits rolled, Vin approached her again, shaking her hand gently. "You okay?" he asked. She smiled. "More than okay." He nodded, his eyes kind. "Good, because I think the world still needs teachers like you." She laughed softly. "I think it needs more people like you, too." As they parted, she glanced back one last time at the glowing screen, the words "for those who still believe in goodness" fading across it. That night, when she returned home, she placed the invitation and the signed poster on her mantel. She sat down in her favorite chair, the same one where she used to read bedtime stories to her children, and looked out the window. The city lights blinked like distant stars, and for the first time in years, she whispered to herself, "I'm proud of me." Her voice trembled, but her smile didn't. Outside, the wind carried her words into the night, a whisper of quiet courage, a promise that even the smallest act of kindness can echo across the world. And somewhere, far from cameras and headlines, Vin Diesel sat alone in his trailer, scrolling through a new video that had just gone viral. Not the confrontation this time, but a short clip from the premiere. It showed Linda walking down the red carpet, smiling shyly as the crowd applauded her. The caption beneath it read, "The woman who reminded us that dignity still exists." Vin leaned back, smiling softly. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "That's family." The world eventually moved on to new stories, new trends, new distractions. But somewhere in countless hearts, the memory of that afternoon at the bank remained. A reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands tall, asks for fairness, and trusts that the right people will listen. And in that truth, the story of Linda Carter, the woman who taught the world how to stand with grace while would never truly end.